A house. $1. Not a typo. No inspection required, no mortgage, no down payment, and still nobody's buying. A for sale sign that's been standing so long the paint's peeled off the post. A realtor who stopped returning calls to that address years ago. You think you know Pennsylvania. Rolling hills and covered bridges, Friday night lights and small-town diners where the coffee's always hot and somebody always knows your name. That's the postcard. That's the version they put on the welcome signs. But drive far enough off the interstate, past the last gas station with a working pump, and the postcard version stops making sense. You start passing houses that look like someone just walked out mid-sentence, curtains still hanging, toys still in the yard, sun bleached and half buried in weeds that haven't been cut in years. And on the porch, or taped to the door, or sometimes just spray-painted straight onto the plywood covering a window, a price. $1. It sounds like a deal. It isn't. It's a warning sign that the market gave up entirely, that a house, a structure that took someone's life savings to build, is now worth less than a cup of gas station coffee. And the people who could tell you why aren't in a hurry to talk about it. Don't assume you understand what happened just because you've seen it on a map. Don't assume the town wants visitors. And don't assume the story ends with the house, because in a couple of these towns, it very much does not. Stick around for number 1. What happened in that town didn't just empty out the houses, it emptied out the reason anyone would ever want to go back. Number 10. Vesper Hollow. Vesper Hollow sounds like the name of a place you'd retire to. Something out of a real estate brochure, rolling hollow, quiet vesper bells, a little Presbyterian church on the hill. And for a while, that's more or less what it was. Founded around a rail spur in the late 1800s, built up through the mid-20th century on the back of a single freight processing plant that, at its peak, employed close to 1,100 people in a town that never had more than 4,000 residents to begin with. That plant closed in 1998. Not gradually, over about 14 months, in 3 rounds of layoffs, the kind where you keep hearing we're optimistic about the next quarter right up until the day they chain the gates. When it closed, it didn't just take jobs. It took the reason the town existed in the first place. You'd expect a slow decline after something like that. Vesper Hollow didn't get a slow decline. It got a cliff. Within 6 years, over a third of the housing stock in the borough was vacant. By the time the county started tracking abandoned structures as a formal blight category in 2009, Vesper Hollow had the highest per capita vacancy rate of any municipality in its region, worse than towns 3 times its size. Walk Main Street today and you'll pass a hardware store with the original hand-painted sign still legible under decades of grime, windows broken just enough to let the weather in, never enough to look deliberately vandalized. That's the unsettling part. Nobody broke in for anything. There was nothing left worth taking. The houses that do sell, and some do, eventually, sell for $1 through the county's tax-delinquent property program on the condition the buyer commits to demolition or rehabilitation within 18 months. Most buyers who take that deal quietly walk away from the deposit instead. It's cheaper than actually doing the work, and once you've stood inside one of these houses, floors soft in places from water damage nobody ever addressed, ceilings sagging under insulation that's been wet for a decade, you understand why. Vesper Hollow isn't dangerous, exactly. It's just empty in a way that feels less like nature reclaiming a place and more like a town holding its breath, waiting for something that isn't coming back. Number 9. Ledger's Mill. Ledger's Mill sounds industrious. Practical, the kind of name a founder gives a town when he's thinking about the books, about balance, about things adding up. For about 90 years they did add up. A paper mill on the creek, a rail siding to move product out, a company store, a company church, the whole self-contained arrangement that so many Pennsylvania towns were built around. Then the math stopped working. The mill's owners sold to a larger conglomerate in 1987, and the conglomerate did what conglomerates tend to do with a facility that's profitable but not profitable enough. They consolidated production elsewhere and shut Ledger's Mill down within 3 years of the acquisition. Here's what makes Ledger's Mill different from a lot of the towns on this list. It's not that people left quickly. It's that they left slowly, unevenly over almost 2 decades, which meant the town never had a single clean break to rally around. No factory closing headline, no town meeting, no clear villain, just a house going empty here, a business closing there, a school district consolidating with a neighboring one in 2004 because enrollment had dropped below viability. By 2015, the borough's own housing survey counted 61 structures as vacant out of a total housing stock of 340, nearly 1 in 5. County assessors started listing properties at nominal values, $1 or $5, specifically to get them off the books and back into private hands, hoping someone, anyone, would take on the liability of ownership. Almost nobody did. You can still find the listings archived, handyman special, investment opportunity, language that means the same thing it always means. This house needs more money spent on it than it will ever be worth. Walk past the old company store. Its brick facade still standing because brick doesn't rot the way wood siding does. And you'll notice something particular to Ledger's Mill. The windows on the second floor are all boarded from the inside, not the outside. As if whoever did it wanted to be able to see out without anyone seeing in. Nobody in town seems to know who did that, or when, and most people you ask don't especially want to talk about it. Number 8. Thistledown. Thistledown has one of those names that sounds soft, almost storybook, something you'd find in a children's book about a sleepy village, and there was a version of Thistledown that fit that description, for a while. A glass manufacturing town, founded around a single furnace operation in the 1880s, it grew to about 2,800 residents at its peak in the 1950s. With a main street that had 2 movie theaters running at the same time, a level of civic life that most towns its size never reached. The glass plant survived longer than you'd expect into the 1990s, but automation cut the workforce by more than 70% over its final decade, from nearly 900 employees down to around 240 before the plant finally closed for good in 2001. The jobs didn't disappear all at once. They evaporated slowly enough that people kept believing things would stabilize. They never did. What sets Thistledown apart is what happened to its housing stock specifically. Because the town had been relatively prosperous, a lot of its housing was built solid, brick row homes, some genuinely well-constructed Victorian-era single families. These aren't the flimsy structures you'd expect to just fall apart. They're sturdy houses in a town with no one left who can afford to live in them, let alone maintain them. The county's land bank, a legal entity set up specifically to manage tax-delinquent and abandoned property, currently holds title to 94 separate parcels in Thistledown, the highest concentration of land bank holdings anywhere in the county. Most of those parcels are listed at $1. A few have sold. Most haven't moved in years. You'd think a solid brick row house for $1 would attract somebody. It doesn't. And once you understand the back taxes, the liens, the code violations that transfer with the deed, regardless of the sale price, you understand why. The dollar isn't the cost of the house. The dollar is the bait. The real cost comes after you sign. Number 7. Cinder Hollow. Cinder Hollow's name isn't subtle. It comes directly from the coal industry that built it, cinder being the byproduct of what got burned to keep the boilers running at the mine that anchored the town for most of the 20th century. At its peak, in the 1940s, close to 1,600 miners worked that operation, supporting a town of just over 4,000. The mine closed in phases through the 1970s and 80s as deep mining became less economical than surface operations elsewhere in the state. The final closure came in 1986. What makes Cinder Hollow's decline distinct is a specific complication most towns on this list didn't deal with: subsidence. Underground voids left behind by decades of mining meant that, over the following decades, sections of the town were quite literally sinking, a slow, uneven settling that cracked foundations, buckled roads, and in at least 11 documented cases rendered homes structurally unsound enough that the borough condemned them outright. That's the specific reason houses in Cinder Hollow sell for $1 and stay unsold. It's not simply that nobody wants to live there. It's that, in certain blocks, nobody legally can. Insurance companies won't write policies on structures in the subsidence zone, and without insurance, no bank will issue a mortgage, dollar sale or not. Cash only, no financing, no protection if the ground moves again. Most people, understandably, aren't willing to take that risk on a house, even a free one. Locals will tell you, if you ask the right person and stick around long enough to earn a straight answer, which streets to avoid, not because of crime, but because of the ground itself. You'd learn to trust that kind of local knowledge fast, too. The first time you noticed a sidewalk that dips 6 inches lower than the driveway it used to line up with. Number 6. Grayspire. Grayspire got its name from a Lutheran church built in 1911, its steeple visible from almost every point in town, a landmark meant to signal permanence. For most of the century it did. The town grew up around textile manufacturing, 3 separate mills running at various points, with a combined workforce that at its height exceeded 2,000 people. Textile manufacturing left Pennsylvania in waves through the 70s and 80s as production shifted overseas, and Grayspire's mills closed in that order, one in 1974, one in 1981, the last hanging on until 1993 before finally shutting its doors. Each closure took a chunk of the population with it. The town's peak population, around 5,200 in 1960, had fallen to under 1,900 by the 2010 census. What you notice walking through Grayspire today is the sheer density of vacant housing concentrated in just a few blocks near the old mill complex, worker housing, built quickly and cheaply in the early 1900s, specifically to house mill employees within walking distance of their shift. That housing was never built to last a century. It was built to last as long as the mills did. And it shows. Sagging porches. Roofs with visible dips where the rafters have started to give. Entire rows where you could count on one hand the number of houses with an intact roofline. The borough started its own Dollar Home initiative in 2011, modeled after similar programs elsewhere, specifically targeting that mill housing block. In 4 years, they sold 9 houses for $1 apiece. Only 2 of those 9 have been meaningfully rehabilitated. The other 7 sit in the same condition, sometimes worse, because a deed transfer doesn't come with a construction crew attached. That steeple's still standing, visible from almost anywhere in town, same as it was in 1911. Everything underneath it has just gotten quieter. Number 5. Blackmore Junction. Blackmore Junction earned its name honestly. It was, quite literally, a rail junction, a place where 3 separate freight lines converged, built specifically to serve the coal and steel operations further up the valley. At its peak in the 1930s and 40s, the junction itself employed several hundred rail workers directly, and the town that grew up around it topped 3,000 residents. Rail consolidation in the 1960s and 70s reduced Blackmore Junction's importance almost overnight. Once the freight lines were rerouted through a larger, more modern yard about 40 miles east, there was simply no reason for the junction to exist anymore. The rail company pulled out entirely by 1971. The town never had another anchor industry to fall back on. It had always existed to serve the junction, and once the junction was gone, the town's reason for being went with it. Today, Blackmore Junction has one of the starkest vacancy rates documented anywhere in the region. County assessors in 2018 put it at 43% of all residential structures standing empty. You can drive entire blocks without passing a single occupied house. And the ones that are occupied are often easy to spot precisely because they stand out. A mowed lawn next to 4 unmowed ones. A working porch light in a row of dark windows. The old rail depot itself, a handsome brick structure that once processed freight manifests for 3 separate lines, still stands at the center of town, boarded and fenced. A designated historic structure that the borough can't afford to restore and won't be granted permission to demolish. It sits there as a kind of monument to the exact moment everything stopped. Houses here go for $1 routinely. What's harder to find is anyone willing to sign the paperwork. Number 4. Fallowfield Crossing. Fallowfield Crossing takes its name from the crossroads where 2 farm-to-market roads met back when the town's economy was built on serving the surrounding agricultural land rather than any single industry. That arrangement worked reasonably well into the mid-20th century, a modest but stable town of around 2,200 with a grain co-op, a farm equipment dealer, and a main street that served the surrounding farms rather than any factory floor. What ended Fallowfield Crossing wasn't a single plant closure. It was consolidation in agriculture itself, smaller family farms getting bought out or folded into larger operations through the 1980s and 90s, which meant fewer farming families living locally, which meant less demand for everything the town's main street had been built to provide. The grain co-op closed in 1996. The farm equipment dealer held on until 2007 before its parent company shuttered the location entirely. Fallowfield Crossing's decline shows up differently than some of the others on this list. Less dramatic vacancy numbers overall, but a specific, well-documented problem with its aging housing stock. A 2016 County Health Department survey found that nearly a quarter of occupied homes in the borough had documented code violations related to structural deterioration, mold, or inadequate heating, meaning even the houses that are lived in are often barely holding together. The dollar home listings here tend to be the ones nobody could even manage to keep occupied that long. Houses where an elderly resident passed away, heirs scattered across 3 or 4 states declined the inheritance outright rather than deal with the taxes and liability, and the county eventually took title by default. Walk those specific streets and you'll notice something particular. Mailboxes still labeled with a family name, years after that family stopped having any connection to the address at all. Number 3. Ashwick. Ashwick was built around a single steel fabrication plant, one that specialized in structural components, beams, girders, the unglamorous infrastructure that held up bridges and buildings across the Northeast. At its peak in the 1960s, the plant employed close to 1,400 people in a town of just under 3,600, meaning the plant's fortunes were, quite directly, the town's fortunes. The plant survived several ownership changes through the 70s and 80s before finally closing in 1991. A casualty of foreign steel competition and an aging facility that would have required a capital investment its final owners weren't willing to make. Unlike some of the closures on this list, Ashwick's came with a specific aftermath that stuck with the town for decades. An EPA remediation designation covering roughly 40 acres of the former plant site due to soil contamination from decades of industrial runoff. That designation matters more than it might seem. Property near a documented contamination site carries a stigma. and, more practically, a liability that follows it regardless of distance from the actual boundary. Real estate agents in the region will tell you, off the record, that homes within roughly half a mile of the old plant site are essentially unsellable at any price above nominal, dollar listing territory, contamination concerns aside from the economic ones. What you notice in Ashwick, walking those streets closest to the old plant, is a specific kind of quiet that's different from simple abandonment. A wariness. Longtime residents who do still live there, and some do, will mention health concerns in the same breath as property values, the two concerns tangled together in a way that's hard to separate. Whether or not the contamination directly explains every health concern residents raise is a matter of ongoing dispute. What isn't disputed is that almost nobody wants to buy a house there, dollar or not. And the county's had those parcels sitting on its books for going on 15 years. Number 2. Hollowfield. Hollowfield sits in a valley that, from the ridge above, still looks almost exactly the way it would have in a 1950s postcard. Church steeples, a grid of tree-lined streets, a main street with intact storefronts. From above, Hollowfield looks like it's doing fine. That's part of what makes it unsettling once you're actually standing in it. Hollowfield was built on textile and light manufacturing, diversified enough that its decline, when it came, wasn't tied to a single plant closure the way so many other towns on this list were. Instead, Hollowfield experienced something slower and, in some ways, harder to fight, a gradual, decades-long hollowing out as manufacturing employment across the entire region contracted. With no single closure to rally against, no single villain, no single headline, just a slow leak that never stopped. By the 2020 census, Hollowfield's population had fallen to 1,140, down from a peak of just over 3,800 in 1970, a decline of more than 70%. And here's the detail that separates Hollowfield from the others. Unlike towns where houses simply fell apart from neglect, a significant portion of Hollowfield's vacant housing stock is in genuinely good structural condition. These are well-built homes, some dating to the early 1900s, maintained reasonably well right up until the moment their last occupants left or passed away, and then simply frozen. Furniture still in place in some cases, because heirs never came to collect it and the county eventually took possession by default. Walking those blocks, you'll pass houses where the porch furniture is still arranged for conversation, where curtains are still drawn in a way that suggests someone meant to open them again soon. It's a specific, quiet wrongness, not decay, but suspension, as though the town simply paused mid-sentence and nobody's returned to finish it. County records show 71 residential parcels currently held in the land bank, most listed at $1, almost all of them structurally sound. And still, almost none have sold. Because a sound structure in an empty town isn't really an asset. It's just a very well-built reminder of how few people are left to want it. Number 1. Cordwood. Everything on this list has followed a version of the same pattern. An industry leaves, a population shrinks, a housing stock empties out faster than anyone can fill it back up. Cordwood followed that pattern too, right up until it didn't, and the point where it diverges from every other town on this list is exactly why it's here, at number 1. Cordwood was a logging and sawmill town, established in the 1890s to process timber for the rail and construction industries, feeding the region's broader industrial growth. At its peak in the 1930s, it supported close to 2,900 residents around 2 competing sawmill operations. Like most single-industry towns, Cordwood declined as the timber ran thin and the mills consolidated elsewhere through the mid-20th century, eventually closing entirely by 1968. That part of the story is familiar. You've heard versions of it 9 times already tonight. Here's where Cordwood becomes something else. In 1979, More than a decade after the mills closed and the town's population had already fallen by over half, a fire broke out in the abandoned mill complex at the center of town. The exact cause was never conclusively determined, though the county fire marshal's report at the time listed arson as the leading theory, given that the complex had been vacant and secured for over a decade. The fire spread faster than the volunteer department, itself down to a skeleton crew, because so few residents remained to staff it, could contain. By the time it was extinguished 2 days later, it had consumed not just the mill complex, but 34 residential structures along the 3 streets closest to it. Nearly a fifth of the town's remaining occupied housing at the time. 6 residents did not make it out. The official county record lists the deaths as fire-related fatalities, local accounts, passed down informally rather than documented in any report, have always maintained the number was actually 7, and that the 7th body was never officially logged because the family in question had already, on paper, vacated the property months earlier and technically weren't supposed to be there anymore. Whether that detail is accurate is impossible to confirm through any official channel. What is confirmed is that the fire marshal's report itself has several sections redacted in the copy held in the county archive, sections that, according to the archivist who's held that position since 2003, have been redacted since before she started the job, for reasons no one currently on staff has ever been able to explain to her satisfaction. Cordwood never recovered from that fire the way towns generally recover from disasters, with rebuilding, with a memorial, with a clear before and after that a community rallies around. Instead, what happened is that the fire seemed to accelerate an emptying that was already underway, except now with an added layer that no amount of time has fully dissolved. Longtime residents, and there are fewer of them every year, will tell you, if you find one willing to talk about it at all, that the 3 streets closest to the old mill complex have never been fully reoccupied since 1979. Even though the structures that replaced the burned ones were rebuilt by the early 1980s with insurance and county disaster funds, people simply didn't move back in. Houses that were rebuilt, structurally sound, modern for their era, sat empty anyway. The county eventually absorbed those parcels into its land bank in the early 2000s, along with most of the rest of Cordwood's remaining housing stock as the population continued its collapse, down to just 214 residents as of the most recent census, a decline of over 92% from its 1930s peak. Every one of those rebuilt houses on the 3 streets closest to the old mill site is currently listed at $1. None has sold in over a decade, despite periodic renewed interest from investors looking at the numbers on paper and seeing what looks like an obvious opportunity. Realtors who've handled those listings, on the rare occasions anyone's shown interest, describe a consistent pattern: initial enthusiasm, a scheduled walkthrough, and then a cancellation, sometimes with no explanation given at all. One agent, speaking anonymously because she still occasionally lists property in the wider area and doesn't want to be associated publicly with what she called the Cordwood reputation, said that in 11 years of handling estate and land bank sales in the county, she has never once completed a sale on any of those 3 streets. Not one. Buyers see the price, drive out, walk the block, and leave without saying much of anything. The mill site itself has never been redeveloped. It sits fenced off at the center of town, foundation stones from the original complex still visible under decades of overgrowth, and the fence has been quietly resecured by the county at least 3 times over the years after being found cut or pulled back. Nobody's ever been caught doing it, and nobody in the current sheriff's department seems eager to prioritize finding out who. You could buy a house on those 3 streets in Cordwood tonight for $1. Structurally sound, rebuilt within the last several decades, move-in ready, on paper. And if you ask the handful of people still living in Cordwood whether you should, the honest answer, the one people actually give when you catch them off guard, isn't about the price or the taxes or the liens. It's simply, don't. From the slow, uneven decline of a town like Ledger's Mill to the specific unresolved history sitting underneath Cordwood, these are communities facing real economic collapse, the kind that doesn't make national news, doesn't get a government bailout, and doesn't reverse itself just because a house gets listed for $1. Vacancy on this scale isn't an opportunity. It's the visible aftermath of a much bigger, slower crisis playing out across dozens of towns just like these all over the state. If this video gave you something to think about, do 3 things for us right now. First, subscribe. We work hard to bring you content that is researched, honest, and important, and channels like this one only keep going with the support of people who want to keep seeing towns like these get covered honestly. Second, drop a comment and tell us, have you ever driven through a town like this? One where the houses were priced to move and still didn't? We read every comment, and we want to hear what you've seen. Third, share this with someone who'd find it useful. Someone researching a move, someone chasing a too-good-to-be-true listing online, or just someone who'd want to know the real story behind a dollar house before they ever got curious enough to ask. We'll see you in the next one.